William Ward Watkin, who came to Houston from Boston in 1910 to administer construction of the original buildings for Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson, and remained at Rice to become the first professor of architecture, was chiefly responsible for the Institute's interwar buildings. The chemistry building of 1925 deviated from the general plan because it was so much bigger than the building projected for that location in the general plan. Although, of course, Watkins still preserved this sort of L-shaped arrangement, again, sort of in framing that cross square that was intended to take place there along the first cross axis. Watkin sought to compensate for the enlarged scale of the building by adopting the materials and stylistic references of his former employer, Cram, who was involved in the design as consulting architect. Watkin continued the practice of incorporating humorous collegiate iconography, in this case detailed by his colleague in the architecture department, the architect, artist, and art historian James Chilman, Jr. Here, H.B. Weiser, professor of chemistry, is a winged monster crushing a hapless student to death. Watkin also designed Cohen House, the faculty club, dedicated in 1927. His use of brick and limestone instead of stucco relates the Cohen House to the administration building. But the house-like scale, asymmetrical composition, and pitched roofs denote its location in the residential group. Cram and Ferguson's last completed project at Rice was the Founders Monument, dedicated at commencement in 1930. Cram recommended the British sculptor John Angel, who modeled the 2,000-pound figure of William M. Rice, seated in a Greek klysmos and dispensing knowledge with one hand, the open book, and, not surprisingly, architecture and planning with the other, the general plan appearing in relief on the unfurled scroll in the founder's left hand. In that the monument was Rice's tomb, his ashes are enclosed within the Texas granite pedestal, one understands how Cram reinforced his social construction of space at Rice by positioning the monument on the main axis, securing commemoration of Rice's magnanimous deed, and personalizing in a mythic, rather than discursively historical fashion, the founding of Rice University. The Founders Monument materializes what anthropologists would describe as a foundation myth, in that it seeks to encapsulate a historical action in idealized imagery, grounding it on the axis of power that passes through the administration building. In the iconography of the monument, architecture and planning represent Rice University. They are the privileged transmitters of William M. Rice's benefaction. They transmit by making the university spatial and therefore real. Where the example of Rice was most strongly felt in the 1920s was in the development of a new spatial precinct along Main Boulevard. This advertisement for the Southmore subdivision shows the relationship of the campus to Herman Park, here Southmore, today more frequently called the Benz neighborhood, just south of Herman Drive and along Main Boulevard, Herman Park. Its site given to the city of Houston in 1914 by George H. Herman, Main Boulevard, which would be transformed into a Parkway Boulevard in 1915-16, the residential enclave of Shadyside, developed by the oilman J.S. Cullinan in 1916-1919 to ensure the spatial integrity of the boulevard, and the site of the Museum of Fine Arts, presented to the Art League of Houston by George Herman's trustees and J.S. Cullinan in 1916, all, of course, in proximity to the campus of the Rice Institute. Like the Founders Monument, the statue of Sam Houston, dedicated in 1925, represents a foundation myth about the city of Houston. The statue's site was positioned in the master plan of Herman Park, prepared in 1915 by the St. Louis landscape architect George Kessler, so that it intersected the main axis of the Rice campus, were the main axis to be projected eastward. The distance is so great that you can't really see it. I mean, you really can't even make out the main entrance to Rice. But basically, this is located so that if you took the main axis from entrance number 1 and brought it eastward across the park, where that axis intersected the axis of Montrose Boulevard, that is where Kessler planted this traffic circle in which Sam Houston's statue was eventually installed. Kessler's implied spatial connection to Rice serves as a metaphor for the ways in which members of Houston's elite in the 1910s and 20s shaped this sector of Houston into a civic arena. They did so by consensus, a consensus constructed around the spatial proposition of Rice's general plan, constructing continuity and spatial hierarchies by shaping space, directing movement, and framing vistas at the scale of the landscape. George Kessler was responsible for transforming Main Street Road into Main Boulevard. He lined it with double rows of live oak trees planted in 1916 and 17. Kessler also planned Shadyside for J.S. Cullinan. The gate piers of Shadyside repeat the threshold landmarking function of Rice's gate piers. Where Main and Montrose intersected, Kessler inscribed a traffic circle to suggest the civic spaces of European boulevards. Facing this intersection is the Museum of Fine Arts, the first public art museum in Texas. It was designed by William Ward Watkin. James Chilman was its first director from 1924, when the museum opened, until he retired in 1953. William Ward Watkin provided the thread of architectural continuity that impressed the Main Boulevard civic arena with its Rice-inspired architectural identity. Watkin designed the Harry C. Wise House in Shadyside of 1920. It sits at the corner of Main Boulevard and Sunset, just next to entrance 1. And the Heitman House next door, also facing out to Main Boulevard in Shadyside. In 1925, both in an Italian villa style that evoked Rice's architecture. Watkin also designed Autry House of 1921. Across Main Boulevard from entrance 3, the entrance nearest the streetcar stop, and next door to it, the Edward Albert Palmer Memorial Chapel of 1927. Although built by the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, Autry House served as Rice's de facto student center until 1949, and Palmer Chapel was intended to be the collegiate chapel of Rice, although it became an Episcopal parish church within 2 years of its completion. Herman Hospital of 1925 joined in the civic architectural discourse. In the Main Boulevard arena, Rice-style Mediterranean architecture coded all these buildings as possessing a spirit of civic cooperation that outweighed differences in ownership and use. Less rhetorical, but even more effective in extending the construction of Rice space beyond the hedges into Houston was William Ward Watkin's practice of planting live oak trees in alleys to shape space, frame vistas, and direct movements. In the subdivision of Southampton, planned in 1923 for the developer E.H. Fleming along Rice's northern border, and in the elite subdivision of Broad Acres, planned in 1922 for Captain James A. Baker's son, James A. Baker, Jr., Watkin constructed continuity at the scale of the landscape by inscribing the coastal plain with redundant alignments of oak trees. Watkin repeated this practice in individual house sites to expand the distinctive Garden City spatiality of the Rice civic arena, systematically constructing what was then the periphery of Houston as Rice space. Since I've concentrated so intently on the local, let me now look at Rice's general plan and architecture in a broader historical context. Rice occupies an important place in a sequence of historically significant planned university campuses built around the turn of the 20th century. Frequently, these conform to the patterns characteristic of Rice. Substantial financial endowments were used by ambitious educational leaders to construct spatial settings that advertised the transformation of 19th century American colleges into modern research universities. Paul Venable Turner, in his Architectural History of American Campus Planning, identifies Stanford University on the left, planned in 1888 by the Boston architects Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, and the University of Chicago on the right, planned in 1893 by the Chicago architect Henry Ives Cobb, as seminal examples. In each, a comprehensive master plan featuring coordinated architectural and landscape design symbolized the aspirations of the university's presidents and their chief donors. Edgar Odell Lovett taught briefly at the University of Chicago before going to Princeton in 1897. Beginning in 1906, Princeton's president, Woodrow Wilson, worked with Ralph Adams Cram to translate administrative and educational reforms into historically resonant Gothic-style architecture. This is Cram's general plan for Princeton, showing, of course, there the problem was that instead of having a completely new site, he had a site with buildings dating to the 18th century. So there, what Cram did, and you can see his sort of darker buildings here, where he proposed locating new buildings to reshape what had been the sort of provincial Presbyterian college and seminary into Woodrow Wilson's vision of a modern research university of national stature. Stanford, Chicago, and Princeton make clear the extent to which American cultural elites during the progressive era of the early 20th century sought to manage modernization by invoking history. They systematically constructed modern institutions such as Princeton's Graduate College by Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson, designed and built at the same time as the first buildings at Rice, as continuous with historical tradition rather than antithetical to it. The construction of continuity, whether based on the choice of historical architectural style or the extension of a designed landscape, profoundly marked the cultural and architectural practices of these progressive era leaders. President Lovett had experienced these trends firsthand at Princeton and Chicago. In 1909, as Lovett and Cram began to plan Rice's campus, the University of Texas commissioned the New York architect Cass Gilbert to design a new university library, now Battle Hall. Edward M. House, son of the Houston commission merchant T.W. House and President Woodrow Wilson's future advisor, secured Gilbert's services for the university. Apart from the coincidental connection to Woodrow Wilson, who was sort of the quintessential American progressive, this pattern of patronage highlights another aspect of Rice's architectural history. During the progressive era, it was not unusual for provincial elites to retain nationally known out-of-state architects, a practice that had been much rarer in the 19th century, to design important local institutions. The professional reputation of a Cass Gilbert or a Ralph Adams Cram reinforced the authority, stature, and implicit claims to cultural leadership of their provincial clients. The two buildings Gilbert designed at the University of Texas, Battle Hall of 1911 and Sutton Hall of 1918, combine Spanish and Italian decorative elements to construct a composite Mediterranean architecture. With fewer rhetorical flourishes than Cram, Gilbert also advanced a Mediterranean architecture as appropriate to Texas. Cram's and Gilbert's stylistic exoticism represents a consensus that prevailed in American architecture through the 1920s on how historical architectural genres could be adapted to represent American regional identities. The penchant for exoticism latent in this practice indicates that the local color movement of late 19th century American literature produced an architectural corollary in which climate, geography, ethnicity, or such conventional sectional distinctions as Southern or Western provided a basis for inventing local identity if the region's cultural traditions were judged insufficiently colorful. Exoticism seems to have overcompensated for what American intellectuals of the progressive era criticized as the shallowness and lack of historical rootedness of mainstream American popular culture. During the 1920s, Ralph Adams Cram's firm designed a number of Byzantine-style buildings, such as the First Presbyterian Church in Tacoma, Washington of 1928, and the Monastery of St. John the Evangelist in Cambridge, Massachusetts of the late 1930s. And indeed, St. John's appears to be modeled on one of Cram's dormitory buildings at Rice. Elements of Byzantine architecture mixed with medieval Italian architecture were employed in the designs of other architects sort of widely spread across the United States. One prominent instance being the new campus of the University of California, Los Angeles of the late 1920s, as can be seen in UCLA's Royce Hall Administration Building and Powell Library, both of 1929 and both designed by California architects. Across town, the older University of Southern California was also expanded during the 1920s with new buildings, culminating in Cram and Ferguson's Doheny Memorial Library of 1932. As this comparison with Lovett Hall makes clear, Cram and his associates used Rice's administration building as the model for USC's Doheny Library. In Houston, though, Cram modified his Byzantine discourse in the 1920s. Cram and Watkin collaborated on the design of Trinity Episcopal Church on Main Boulevard of 1919. Watkin seems to have taken the lead in designing this, his parish church, in the neo-Gothic style, which was the architectural style for which Cram was best known. Between 1923 and 1926, Cram and Watkin collaborated on a new central library in downtown Houston, now the Julia Addison Library Building. Cram designed the library building in the Spanish style to pay tribute to the 18th century cultural heritage of Texas. What was Rice-like was the way that the Central Library became the basis for the Civic Center Master Plan of 1925, designed by the landscape architects and planners Hare and Hare. Here you see Cram's Central Library facing onto Herman Square, and then Hare and Hare projected all these other buildings, including a Spanish-style city-county administration building that would surround Herman Square, repeating the architectural language and site configuration of the Cram Library Building. Hare and Hare followed Cram's and Watkins' example at Rice as they sought to construct continuity by framing vistas, directing movement, shaping space, and systematically integrating landscape architecture and architecture. Only one other building, the Federal Land Bank of 1928, which was not even part of the 1925 Civic Center plan, it was actually sort of built about a block away, but facing the Cram Library, adhered to the precepts of the Hare and Hare plan. Cram designed one of the most important houses of his career in Houston for Blanche Harding, an amateur artist and Rice alumna, and her husband, the wholesale grocer Cleveland Sewell. Completed in 1926 on Inwood Drive in River Oaks, the Sewell House was a bravura production in the Spanish style. William Ward Watkin designed notable houses in the Spanish style, such as the B.B. Gilmer House in Broad Acres of 1926 and the Casa de Mañana for the sugar refiner W.T. W.T. Eldridge in Sugar Land of 1928. The Eldridge House clearly indebted architecturally to Watkins' design for the Cohen House at Rice, especially with its tower. Typical of the eclectic 1920s, however, the choice of a Spanish style seems to have had less to do with propounding a cultural discourse than with clients' and architects' personal preferences. Watkins combined Spanish-style architecture with Cram-like spatial expansiveness in the master plan he prepared with Sanguinet, Stotts, and Hedrick of Fort Worth for Texas Tech University in Lubbock of 1924. On the left, the Watkins-Hedrick master plan. On the right, the first building, the administration building of 1925. Watkins' administration building is as indebted to the Houston Central Library as it is to Rice's administration building. But both the campus plan and original buildings of Texas Tech demonstrate the profound impact that Cram's work at Rice had on Watkins' formation as an architect. They also demonstrate how the practices embedded in the design of Rice's buildings and the shaping of its campus spaces affected civic development beyond Houston in the 1920s and 30s.